Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to CILA for inviting us to be a part of this programming. Um, I am from the Standing Committee on Pro Bono and Public Service, which, like the Commission on Immigration being the home of immigration within the ABA, we are the home of pro bono generally within the American Bar Association. And we are going to be talking about the ABA standards, which are one of the things that the committee has done to fulfill its mission to promote, develop, and encourage pro bono legal services by lawyers. But I do want to just take a step back before we get into the standards and talk a little bit about why we even have pro bono lawyers engaged in serving clients generally, but specifically in immigration as well. And I saw that there's a lot of familiar names in the chat. Thank you everyone for introducing yourself. I saw there's a lot of folks who are already engaged in managing pro bono lawyers in this realm. So I'm not going to dwell on this part too long, but I do want to kind of set the scene. It's tempting sometimes to think, why do we even have pro bono attorneys? It takes so much work to train them and to help them along, and sometimes they disappear and sometimes they get on my nerves, and it takes staff money away to have someone in a position of managing all these pro bono lawyers. We could use that for a staff attorney who could do this all so much more efficiently. And those are worth thinking and considering, and it's always good to reassess why you have pro bono lawyers involved. But there's a number of benefits to engaging pro bono lawyers. And the first one is that it leverages scarce resources. We all know that there's not an endless flow of funds for staff attorneys to provide representation. And there's far more clients than any one program could manage to represent with your staff attorneys. Pro bono lawyers allow us to, with a few people helping them either through managing their caseload or through providing mentoring, etc., it helps us leverage the money that we do have and create a larger pool of lawyers who can provide brief advice, counsel, and representation to our clients. So while it's tempting to think we could use that money for a staff attorney, being able to use a small pool of money, or a relatively small pool of money, towards leveraging that into basically an army, hopefully, of pro bono volunteers, helps us expand our services with the resources that we do have in place. There's some intangible reasons to engage pro bono lawyers as well, and those are around educating folks about the needs of the clients that they're representing and the needs of your organization. A lot of lawyers are not going to encounter these legal issues or these client populations who have these legal issues except through pro bono work. And they obviously are somewhat open to being empathetic towards your clients by virtue of being a volunteer, but meeting your clients, hearing their stories, learning about the difficulties that they've gone through, it really helps them to become advocates for the issues surrounding your client population. And similarly, it helps them to understand how few resources we currently dedicate towards helping these client populations, and frequently results in them being advocates for greater resources going to our organizations. I have seen a lot of attorneys who were, mildly interested in issue X or issue Y, whether it's homelessness or immigration or what have you. Once they volunteer and they meet the people who are getting the services and see how hard our nonprofits work to provide as much services as possible to folks, they become very passionate. And, we have the ABA Day each year where we go to Capitol Hill with a bunch of members of the American Bar Association to educate legislators about certain issues. And a lot of them who are lobbying for funds to go towards legal services are there because they have been a volunteer and they have experienced all of the angles from the program side and working with clients. And so they become incredible advocates. So those are some reasons why it's important to engage volunteer lawyers in pro bono work, and why it's so worthwhile to dedicate the resources towards doing so. And I mentioned that I did see some familiar names in the chat and some folks saying they were pro bono managers, but we did want to just quickly do a little poll here to give a sense of how many people are in a pro bono management position within their organization, and how many people are not. So if you could take a second to answer that poll before I turn it over to my colleague, Marissa, to talk about the standards, we'd appreciate it. And in the meantime, in the interest of time, I will pass the baton on to Marissa. Okay. Wow.
Excuse me. So it looks like our poll results, there are 75% of you are already working with pro bono volunteers. So that's great. That's a great number and a great response. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the standards for programs providing civil pro bono legal services to persons of limited means. The ABA standards, as we often call them, for pro bono were developed by the Standing Committee on Pro Bono and Public Service. And really, they are a black letter outline that provide the elements for a successful pro bono program. There are areas such as governance, program infrastructure and design, relations with clients, and relations with volunteers that are covered in the standards. And we also, in the materials for this, did include a copy of those that you can look at and refer to. In the standards, not only is there the black letter outline, but there is also a commentary that includes some expansion on some of those specific areas. And we also have links to certain documents. So if you're looking for example, a survey for your attorneys on their satisfaction with a case or types of cases they're interested in, we have links to things such as those so that you don't have to reinvent things that are already working for other programs. And I think, what's helpful is also to kind of step back a little bit and talk about what we're talking about whenever we are referring to pro bono service, which is free legal services through the use of volunteers to persons of limited means and persons who serve them. That definition that we look at is also based on Model Rule 6.1, which encourages 50 hours a year of pro bono services to persons of limited means. Really, we look at the standards as sort of just a best practices guide, and it covers a lot of the same topics that we're going to be talking about today, and kind of breaks down how to develop a successful pro bono program. Whenever we have individuals, we provide quite a bit of technical assistance and support at the Center for Pro Bono. So if someone calls us and says, hey, I have a problem with this with my pro bono program and I'm looking for some resources, or what are the best practices for recruiting volunteers or recognizing volunteers or developing an infrastructure of pro bono, the standards is usually what we go to and what we look for. So it's a really helpful document, especially whenever you're first developing a pro bono program, or even after you've already developed something, to go back to and refer to kind of see what other best practices are. We do have a program called the Peer Consulting Project here through the ABA Center for Pro Bono, where whenever programs are looking for ideas and assistance on how to improve their pro bono program, we will come out with volunteer consultants and take a look at the program and take a look at what you're doing pro bono wise, and come up with some recommendations for your program to improve and engage more attorneys. And we base all of those reports on the standards for pro bono. So it's a great, helpful resource for anyone, and I encourage you to use it if you're looking for assistance. It's a great way to, and I think to just kick us off what we're talking about today, when you're looking at how to start your pro bono program, one of the places you really want to start is to ensure that you have the necessary elements to adequately resource your pro bono. So you need adequate staff and resources, And you need to ensure that your volunteers are experienced in providing services to support your client population. And all of those are really laid out in the standards document. So that's just sort of a brief overview of that. And most of what we're talking about today, though, is going to be based on different topics within the standards. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate to sort of talk about, to start us talking about project design. And before that, I think we had a quick poll question here about if you are working with pro bono volunteers, how do you feel about that? Do you love them? Are you indifferent, or, no comment at the end?
All right. Well, those answers all start coming in. I'm going to give my answer to say I love them. So I do a lot of trainings for volunteers to volunteer with my own organization, as well as a lot of trainings for volunteers to volunteer with other partnering organizations in my state. And I primarily love my volunteers that I use in kind of a clinic setting. And I'm so excited to share with you guys my approach, because I think a lot of organizations do use volunteers for cases and think about placing cases with them. But I really encourage for you guys to really think creatively about providing some limited scope opportunities. And I'm kind of just here to share my approach. I do have a checklist that I put in your materials, where I have outlined some of the important decisions that someone might want to make when deciding that they want to create a new volunteer opportunity, particularly in kind of a limited scope clinic setting. My overarching approach to everything is that I really do try and break down everything into little pieces. And when I say break down everything into little pieces, I think, take the broadest scope of activity that might need to happen or that anyone needs to do, and really kind of break it down both into what you need to do, what the volunteer needs to do, what the client needs to do. And I think that'll help you stay organized, but also kind of help you maybe feel a little bit more comfortable with trying out a new volunteer opportunity. I also do want to note, I know that many of you are working with volunteers, but for those of you who maybe are not yet employing volunteers in your project, one of the biggest things, and where do I start, is looking into getting malpractice insurance to cover your volunteers, because that is the number one question that I will get from new volunteers, particularly if we want to look at leveraging that kind of untapped resource where we're going to be educating attorneys who maybe aren't working with immigrants day in and day out. Their first question is always like, well, I don't practice immigration law, so like I don't have malpractice insurance. And you're going to want to be in a position where you're saying, don't worry, we have you covered, both from the mentorship point of view, but also from the liabilities point of view. We have your back. So malpractice insurance. Also, you really want to start at the very beginning and to decide the scope of your opportunity or your clinic. And I encourage you to be creative about that. I know at my clinics, we do consults all the time, day in and day out. Someone walks into the clinic, they know nothing about their case. Sometimes they didn't even know that they were coming to the building for a court hearing, because our consults take place at the court, and they leave with a plan. But we've also, in my project, we've done clinics around family deportation planning to help parents plan for what's going to happen to their children if they actually do become deported. I've attended asylum pro se clinics, which I felt were very meaningful as a volunteer. Sometimes there have been organizations that I've worked with where we've created intake clinics. Basically, an organization received a whole pot of new funding where they were required to suddenly represent, X number of new cases. And we're like, whoa, how do we onboard this? We used volunteers to do all of those intake questions. And at the end of the day, some of those volunteers ended up offering pro bono assistance to some of the cases that the organization was then going to make a part of their program. And then I've also done a predicate order clinic where, the goal of the clinic was there's actually an organization that was down a staff member, and they had all of these pending special immigrant juvenile status cases. So we designed a clinic around using volunteers to not even communicate with the client at that point, but to communicate with the organization and kind of look at the file, look at the standards of the law, look at the information that had been gathered, and try and kind of organize the notes, if you will, so that that new employee that was being onboarded, had organized files. And, I think you can really do lots of things in a clinic setting. So long as, right, there's like a goal that you can create that's I'm going to do X thing that's going to help my organization push forward Y need. And kind of, and it is that investment, but at the end of that clinic day, you will be getting something out of it if you think really creatively. And then maybe those volunteers will come back, right? And each time they come back, you need to invest in them less and less. And if you set them up for a really successful opportunity, they are more likely to come back. Now, how do you create that successful opportunity where that volunteer feels comfortable, where they feel supported, where they feel like their answers, their questions are going to be answered? I always do really like to start by visualizing the service that is being provided to the service seeker as an assembly line. We're all humans here. We're humans doing good work for other fellow humans, working and leveraging volunteers who are also humans. But I think that sometimes it is helpful still to visualize kind of an assembly line of what needs to happen when. Because on the day of a clinic, when you are working with lots of volunteers and I guess handling a higher volume of clients that you might be handling at one time, right? Because when you're in your office and you're doing something for your cases, it's you and the client and your case. But when you're having a clinic and you're supervising volunteers, you're dealing with multiple cases all at the same time. And you really want to kind of do some thinking around how that service is going to be provided. What's going to happen when people enter the clinic? What do people need to do to be able to enter the clinic in the first place? Who does that client speak to first? What things need to be filled out? Do they need to register? What sort of information needs to be gotten? Okay, and then when does that client speak with the volunteer? What volunteers need to be in the room? Does the service require notarization? Do we need notaries on site? And if you think of it like an assembly line, I think that you'll really set yourself up to have a base way to approach what you're going to be doing at the clinic. And I really like to think about volunteer instructions, creating a roadmap, checklist. And if I can't decide kind of a procedure for the way the volunteers are going to reach the goal, then maybe I'm not prepared to use them. But if I am able to sit down and write a checklist of who's going to happen or what's going to happen when, what happens before the next thing, then not only do I know that I'm prepared to use them, but I also then feel more prepared to use them. And going into the clinic day, I have a base for when things get stressful. I have a baseline kind of thing to anchor myself into. I also encourage you guys to think about how you package all of the materials that you are going to be using for the clinic. For my clinics, I do like to try and create a volunteer folder, that each volunteer gets a folder that has all of the stuff that they need to provide the service that day. It also has any sort of reference materials that I have for them. And within that packaging, we also use a color coding system for all of the papers, right? It's just kind of little details like that, because we're always afraid that clients are going to walk away sometimes with the notes that we want to keep, right? Because there will be times when the service seeker, the service recipient does need to walk away with information, but you also want to be able to keep a record of the service that was being provided. So we use a color coding, and that any sort of document that we need to keep, and by we, I mean the organization we need to keep, we print that out on yellow paper. And then, there are certain clinics where the documents that we give to the clients are printed out on purple paper. And it's just a little thing like that, which I can't tell you how many times I've been at a clinic and I have seen a client start walking away with their registration sheet, that yellow piece of paper that maybe a volunteer accidentally gave to them or that they took from the pile. And I'm able to say, oh, they have a yellow piece of paper. Someone please go stop them, right? And then they can explain, but we don't have to, and it's a nice way to make things just easy to note when something's happening. And then also, in addition to the documents that you are creating for the clinic, one of the things that I always do encourage people to do in thinking about, what's the client going to do, what's the volunteer to do, also to be really mindful about what you as the organization are going to do, and kind of what spaces do you need to make notes, and making things kind of just as routine as possible, so that when you show up at the clinic, you have a plan, you can execute it, and you kind of have a pathway for when emergencies occur.
Thanks, Kate. So one of the things that Kate talked about at the beginning was liability insurance and malpractice insurance. So we did want to ask really quickly, we had a quick poll question about whether or not you all, if you are using volunteers, are you providing malpractice insurance for your volunteers? And then while you all are answering that, I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl to talk a little bit about recruitment.
All right, and since you all are answering a poll, I'm just gonna give you fair warning that I am going to ask you to put something in the chat. So get your typing fingers ready. Great, it looks like almost 3/4 of you have malpractice insurance. And for those of you who don't, I do really recommend that you offer that for your volunteers. I can back up the statement earlier about that being a key question from volunteers. It is a question we almost always get from volunteers that we talk to on peer consulting visits, and in our data collection studies, which we're on the 5th iteration of, that is always a top dismotivator for attorneys, a reason that they cite for not doing pro bono. So if you have it, I would definitely put it right out there in your recruitment speech and materials, because that is something that lawyers are looking for. So in terms of what I'm going to ask you to put in the chat, and I hope that a few of you will respond, I'm going to ask you all to think about something that you do as a volunteer, whether it's serving on the PTA at your school, going on field trips with your kids, bringing snacks to your kids' soccer team, volunteering at the library, whatever it is. Think about a volunteer opportunity. Maybe you help do a run or walk in your community, and put in the chat how you ended up doing that volunteer opportunity. So what was the recruitment technique that got you engaged in doing that volunteer work? So a few of you will hopefully answer this. A friend encouraged me, social media, awesome. I'm gonna let you all keep typing away into the chat and talk about one of the challenges of recruiting that we face right now. I think this is probably the first time in history that we've had so many active generations engaged in the practice of law, and they all differ in the way that they want to communicate. So it is a huge challenge for all of us who are trying to reach out to and recruit these attorneys, because you cannot talk to a boomer the same way you can talk to a millennial. And by talk to them, I mean, the means of communication. There are folks out there who do not answer their phones anymore. So you can't call those people But if you try to use a TikTok to recruit a boomer, it's probably not going to work. So it means that we have to reach out through a number of different ways. And I think you can kind of see that reflected in the chat here. We've got, friends, social media, organizations asking people to volunteer, someone coming up at a conference. There's a lot of personal interaction here, and that is always a great way, because one of the hardest things to do on a face-to-face conversation is say absolutely not. I'm sure you've all experienced this in your work role, where someone says, can you do this by tomorrow? And if they're face-to-face with you, it's harder to say no. But if they ask you by email, you can always feel a little better about saying, yeah, I'm not going to do that tomorrow. I've got too much on my plate. So that personal ask is always a good way to recruit people. And it doesn't matter which generation. That's pretty effective across the board. And it doesn't have to be you. It doesn't have to be someone in your program. It can be the other volunteers who are already doing pro bono work for you. It can be a board member. And someone actually mentions a board here in the chat as being one of the routes they took to be involved as volunteers. So I encourage you that when you're thinking about recruitment, definitely leverage yourself if you are the pro bono manager, or everyone else if you are not the pro bono manager, to help your pro bono program do the recruitment. Have your volunteers reach out to people that they work with. Have your board members talk to people, because that face-to-face ask is always the most effective, regardless of generation. But then, you need to think about a strategy that's going to amplify that message by electronic communication. And like I said, that varies in effectiveness from generation to generation. So hitting email, hitting social media, making sure that your website prominently offers the opportunity to give to your organization, either through time and or money. Those two go hand in hand, by the way. And making those asks in as many ways as possible and getting it out there as frequently as possible is, going to enhance your chances of getting responses and getting volunteers. And I know that you all face an additional challenge in recruitment because immigration is not the easiest area of law to recruit for. It's not something that people tend to be engaged in practicing, so it's a whole new area of law that they might have to learn. So you've got that challenge to face, and your messaging should reflect all the training, the support, the mentoring that your organization offers in order to support people. Because I know as lawyers, we tend to be really risk averse. And I recall at my previous position where I was managing attorney, every new attorney that we hired asked me the same thing the first time they had to go to court, and that was, where do I stand? So that's kind of the granular level of apprehension that lawyers have, and assuring them that you can tell them where to stand, tell them what the law is, be available to be a sounding board if they have questions about whether they're structuring their argument in the correct way. All of those things are going to alleviate their fears and make them more likely to volunteer for your organization. The other challenge I know you all face is that these cases are not necessarily quick to resolve. And as someone who used to recruit lawyers to do family law, I'm very familiar with the fear of getting involved for an undefined period of time. Lawyers would like to, be able to say, I'm going to be here for a year or a month or 1 hour, and get my pro bono done in that amount of time and no more. And that's a real challenge when you are not in charge of the docket in the immigration courts, when you don't know when cases are eventually going to come before the court. So just being realistic with your potential volunteers and letting them know the situation and using it as an opportunity to educate them on the issues that your clients are facing, because they're facing the same challenge, right? They're waiting, they're kind of in limbo, not knowing what's going on, and making it a human interest issue that can really touch the hearts of lawyers who want to volunteer, and getting them on the hook that way is a good angle to work with when you're recruiting for something that you don't know how long it will be. The other thing is to do what was mentioned earlier in terms of providing different kinds of volunteer opportunities, not just full case representation, but if there's a way to offer some brief advice clinics to help people with shorter pieces of their case, that's an opportunity to recruit attorneys who may then feel comfortable enough doing immigration work that they're interested in doing full representation down the line. The last thing I'll touch on with recruiting is that we have found through our data collection projects that there's essentially 3 motivators, and they kind of break down by generation or age range. And when you're reaching out to attorneys to ask them to do pro bono work for your organization, you want to be able to touch on all 3 potential motivators in order to get the message that lands and resonates with the people that you're talking to. And the first motivation is that it's the right thing to do. And this tends to be the older generations. They went to law school because they wanted to be, as we all did, they wanted to be important to the community and uphold the law. And they're the folks who used to be active in chambers of commerce and all the groups that people are not as engaged in these days. And that's reflected in the fact that they do pro bono work because when they took their oath, they said they would do pro bono work. It's part of our professional responsibility. It's the right thing to do. And that is why they're doing pro bono work. They just need to find the right opportunity because they are mentally committed to doing pro bono work. It's just a matter of where that pro bono work will be done. And so with those folks, you want to kind of emphasize that message. We're lawyers. Nobody else can do this. Nobody can go in and provide that legal advice to these clients other than people with a JD and a license to practice law. The second motivation that we typically see is that it's a personal area of interest. And this tends to be kind of the middle age range. So younger than boomers, but a little bit older, a little bit more life experience. And there you want to do pro bono work because it's an issue that is critically important to them. I will say my phone never rings, and I think it's pretty funny that it's doing that right now. Sorry about that. So if people are interested in helping children, offering them the opportunity to represent children, or if they're committed to making life better for families, providing a message that helps them understand how families are in need of representation, how providing pro bono to migrants helps them restore their family and strengthen it and put their families in a better place would be the right messaging for that particular age group, motivated primarily by their areas of interest. And it sounds kind of the same, but it's a little bit different. The third motivator that we've seen is making an impact. And that's the youngest folks who are out there, the people who have most recently graduated from law school and who are out there looking for a way to really make this world a better place. They want to see an impact. So you want to be able to message to them, if you provide pro bono legal services to our clients, this is the impact that you will see in the world. This is the impact that you are helping our organization create and make this world a better place. So having those 3 key areas of motivation in mind when you're working on written materials or preparing remarks to a bar association or just talking to someone one-on-one really helps you kind of aim your message at a place where it's actually going to be received and heard and internalized and hopefully resonate enough to get that person to volunteer with you. And with that, I will turn it over to the next section.
Yeah, and so there's definitely a need for more people to get involved in immigration law, because I know, at least in my area, right, if everyone in court proceedings in Maryland could even pay to afford an attorney, there just aren't enough deportation defense attorneys around who do deportation defense as their primary area of practice. Going back to the point kind of where you're leveraging attorneys to kind of build capacity to serve the people that your organization serves and people in the community who need help. So to build that capacity, you will have to work with attorneys who do not practice immigration law and who are going to have to get over that kind of daunting, I don't know anything about immigration law feel. And you're going to want to make sure to reach out to them and support them so that they can feel comfortable serving well the immigrant community that you're trying to help with their assistance. And so to do that, my organization, we do a lot of free trainings in exchange for a pro bono commitment to really decrease the barrier to get involved, right? You could sign up for a training. Okay. And then once you sign up for the training, you're hooked and you feel a little bit more comfortable. And when I put together a training for any of my clinics, I kind of follow the mantra of tell them what you're going to tell them, and then circle back to remind them of what you just said. And what I mean by that is that volunteers will often need to hear some of the same things several times before it sinks in, because the volunteers that you were working with, again, if they don't practice immigration law, right, they're learning everything. It's, for the first time, and it's different. And if you could think back to the time, you were all not immigration law practitioners once, and, you sit there and you approach your first case, and then or you're dealing with an unaccompanied child for the first time, and it's like, wait, they have their immigration court proceedings and their special immigrant juvenile status family court proceedings, and they have their USCIS stuff, right? It's a lot. But you've gotten used to it over time. And so you're going to want to build into the way that you train your volunteers, kind of helping them get used to it with baby steps and kind of layering on each time. And so before any of my clinics, I do like to offer a pre-recorded training that talks about just the law, nothing else but just the law. We'll offer it live, and we will record the training so that volunteers can refer back to the training at a later time. Volunteers can refer back to the training, when they're and watch it again just before the clinic. Volunteers could maybe refer back to the trainings, even maybe when they're doing some of their pro bono opportunities, right? Building it out. If you're going to do a case training, building it out so that the volunteer, when they get to a certain part of the case, might be able to go to a certain part of the training to kind of brush up. And then in addition to the training in advance of the opportunity, I also do like to do a separate training that literally is just the logistics, an orientation on about how the volunteer opportunity is going, to address some of the things that Cheryl was talking about, like, how long is the opportunity going to take? What are they expected to do? Like, what are we actually doing here? What's expected of me? Do I get to say goodbye at the end of the clinic? What do I need to do after the clinic? To really kind of lay it out from the beginning. And I like to break those two kinds of trainings out into two separate days, one for the substantive law and one for the actual orientations. And I do that for two reasons. The first is to talk both about the substantive law, and I think also to get into the detail that you might want to get into related to the logistics and the orientation information for volunteering with the program. That's a lot to cover in one sitting. And, volunteers and, people can only absorb so much new information at one time. Also, breaking it out between the substantive law training versus the orientation logistics training. When the law changes, you can go back and revisit that substantive law training, or more likely, as you do these volunteering opportunities over time, and as you're crafting your project and refining and self-editing over time, you can go back and edit that orientation without having to then redo your whole legal training if you keep it separate, which I think is really nice. It also gives volunteers an opportunity to kind of focus on one thing first and the second thing second. And so that's kind of those pre-recorded videos before someone shows up at the clinic is my tell them what you're going to tell them, right? This is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to be talking about. But then the training continues at the clinic itself, where you want to be available as a resource to the volunteers, but there might only be one of you, or there might only be one or two staff members for you. And in your clinic kind of assembly line, you are going to want to build in checkpoints where the volunteers are communicating with you directly and will need to communicate with you directly. But you're also going to want to give the volunteers resources and reference materials such that they don't always have to come back to you specifically, because there might only be one or two of your staff members when there might be like 20 volunteers, depending upon what kind of clinic you're doing, and, volunteer attorneys, volunteer interpreters, a lot of different moving parts. And so you'll want to build out resources. For example, at my consult clinics, we do have a cheat sheet on the law. It's basically 2 sides of a page, and it talks about the most common deportation offenses that come up at our clinic. And I actually instruct volunteers in the volunteer checklist, like, hey, when you're waiting for your mentor checkpoint to come and speak with me, look at the cheat sheet, right? Like, write down your answer, form your legal opinion, such that when it's your turn to speak with me, I can say, okay, go. What have you learned? What do you think? Yes, no, delve further, ask those questions. Or with the interpreters, right? The interpreters all know Spanish, so we give them a glossary for some of those legal terms that they can kind of have in hand at the clinic that we print out for them, so they don't have to worry about bringing anything, that they can show up and still feel supported. For our trainings, the clinic ones, we do in-house for people to volunteer with my organization, but PBRC has also gotten together with some of the other organizations in the area where we coordinate and host the training to help recruit the volunteers. And then we refer them out to some of our partner organizations who can use them for kind of different, more full scope direct opportunities. And we have found that this works well. And, different areas across the country in your different states, you may want to think about getting together with some of your kind of neighbor organizations, because not everyone needs to be having their own separate volunteer training necessarily, right? If we're all trying to teach this big pool of volunteers the same law, get together, collaborate, right? And divide and conquer the areas of law, and kind of who's going to present on different kinds of law, to kind of decrease the burden on kind of one specific organization and trying to train the collective volunteer pool that we're all trying to motivate to get involved. Also, as far as kind of partnering, not all of our speakers are from nonprofit organizations. We leverage private attorneys for some of our trainings, like our special immigrant juvenile status training that we hold. It's just 2 wonderful private attorneys that we have just kind of built a relationship with, that we can call every year or so to say, hey, can we redo a live one and make sure that it has updates for the special immigrant juvenile status? And they are happy to do it, because that's kind of one of their ways that they feel like they can, do pro bono and assist the community. Also a note on training, I did mention some of the resources that we have at the clinics, but you'll also want to think about how you can kind of build out resources for any sort of direct representation volunteers. Going back to that, recording those trainings to give them access to it when they work on a case. All of the volunteers that we train who volunteer with us or elsewhere are invited to a Google group where it's kind of neat, because we invite the volunteers to a Google group, but then and they can ask their case questions, and over time it's kind of fun to see people who I know that we trained as a volunteer are now the ones who are answering the questions of other volunteers that are sent to the Google group, right? So as you're your new volunteers become your experienced volunteers, they can become your mentors, and kind of doing a Google group is just one really easy way to leverage that. In that vein, Google Drive is also wonderful, right? If you want to be able to make sure to distribute materials and resources and updated laws or new kind of mentoring resources or case pleadings or whatever it is, in a way that's kind of, you can plunk it there, you can tell the volunteers that it's there, but then they have a nice easy way to access it, so they don't always have to come back to you every time and email you and wait for you to email back to them. And I think that's kind of where I am on the training.
Great. Thanks, Kate. So I am going to finish this up by talking about retaining your volunteers and recognizing them. So you have all of these great volunteers, you've recruited them. Now, what do you do to keep them engaged and coming back to volunteer? So one of the main points I think that's really important to remember, that probably all of you who work with pro bono volunteers already know, is that pro bono management, a lot of it is just about relationships. It's about building those relationships and maintaining those relationships with your volunteers and building those strong relationships in order to keep them coming back and volunteering and working with you. What are some ways to do that? I would say number one on the list is having a strong communication. Make sure that your volunteers from the beginning are clear about the expectations, and not only the volunteers should be clear, but the clients as well. I know I've worked with quite a few programs that during consulting visits will talk to volunteer attorneys about what their experience has been like. And, one of the main complaints you will hear is that the client maybe didn't have as clear of an expectation presented to them about what they needed to do on their part of it, and maybe some frustration on the part of volunteer attorneys. Another part of sort of dealing with that is, being there to handle those issues, screening your cases effectively, and then also presenting that training as part of your training. Remember to train all of your volunteers on some of those cultural competency issues and dealing with working with clients who maybe are going through a lot of other struggles. And so sometimes these things fall by the wayside, and, volunteer attorneys get frustrated because, oh, this client isn't calling me back, or they missed a meeting or something like that. So have that training about what it's like and what your clients sometimes are going through, and have all of your volunteers familiar with that. Offering training, mentoring, and support throughout the case, at the beginning, during the case, checking in with your volunteers to find out how things are going and what they need, and making sure that they know that you are there to support them. Things that Kate was talking about that are great are creating your documents, having available trainings and available documents for your volunteers. During and after the representation, sending out follow-up surveys, checking in with the volunteers to get their feedback about how your project is working. Are things going well for them? What was their experience like? And then take those things into consideration as you're continuing to build and develop your pro bono projects. Take that feedback seriously and try to listen to that as you are continuing to build pro bono projects. And also, offering those varied opportunities and experiences to pro bono attorneys, so that they're able to efficiently use their skills, interests, and expertise. And then also, if maybe you have a volunteer attorney who has been doing some direct representation and they're kind of like, I need a break from this. So have some other opportunities for them. Maybe that experienced attorney can transition for a little while to a mentor, because maybe they need, a little bit of a break from doing direct representation. But just offering those varied opportunities while still keeping those relationships and trying to just really do what your volunteers need and what their expertise is suited for. Also a great way, to let your attorneys know that they are appreciated is to recognize them in various ways. There are a lot of different models as far as recognition of attorneys. It really depends on kind of what works for your program and your volunteers. It could be, a big awards luncheon or a big awards dinner. It can be something much smaller, like sending personalized thank you notes to your attorneys to thank them for their participation, having client thank yous. If a client tells you, you know, oh, this attorney did a great job on this case, you know, send them a little note and say, hey, here's the feedback that I got from this client, so that they know that they're doing a good job and that they're appreciated and you're recognizing that. You can also use newsletters, social media, your website, have volunteer features on what volunteers are doing, and recognize their work and put it out there. You know, that can also be a great way to recruit other attorneys by showing, you know, these are the opportunities that we have. This is how you can get involved, and showing you that you really do appreciate the work that they're doing. If you are doing some sort of awards, involve, you know, your local bar association, involve judges and the judiciary as much as possible. There also are a number of outside awards that you can nominate your volunteers for through either state bars, the ABA, or other organizations. Just as kind of a plug, remember it is October is coming up, and that is the National Celebration of Pro Bono. So that's a great opportunity to recognize your volunteers. That's going to be October 22nd to 28th this year. But really the whole month of October, some states have gone to that now. That's a great opportunity to just plug your volunteers, show your appreciation for them, have social media posts or newsletter stories or website posts about all of the work that they're doing and show them that you appreciate it. And I think that's mostly what I have on recognition. Does anybody want to share in the chat, or Kate or Cheryl, any ideas on some really creative recognition ideas that you've seen, or has anyone in listening, do you want to put in the chat just some ideas that you have that you think have been helpful or have been effective for you as far as recognizing your volunteers?
When people are putting in their things in the chat box, I have found thank yous are sometimes hard to keep up with, but it really is important to try and do that personalized thank you. So something that we've started doing at PBRC is using a mail merge, because you can actually send an email thank you that is personalized by using a mail merge, and we have found that that's really helpful, and we get a lot of responses back from our thank yous that people read them, and you know, it was way quicker. I used to spend hours handwriting thank yous, but it was hard to keep up. But I do see one from Zia Oatley in the chat box.
Yeah, that's great. A handwritten thank you card from an organization, and then also a note from the client included in it as well from the organization. That's great. So we have about I guess we have a little over 5 minutes left, but I'll just open it up now to any questions that anyone has for us, and any, I guess, last minute tips. Oh, I didn't see that question. Someone else in the chat, I'll just throw this out there real quick, send out a Volunteer of the Month award each month, and we email the attorney or non-attorney and put it on social media with a headshot and a quote. That's great. We see a lot of those come through, I know, on our social media, and oftentimes we try to share them to really just get that out there more and show the great work that individuals are doing, and just show the opportunities that are available as far as pro bono work. It looks like
Stephanie put that there was a question in the Q&A. How do you reconcile the tension between centering clients and recognizing the pro bono lawyer? And that is continually a challenge for pro bono managers. You essentially have two client bases. You have the volunteer attorney clients, and you have the people who need legal help clients. And you do want to be mindful about centering folks who are in need of help, especially in areas like immigration or housing, where, you know, it's impacting their lives so deeply. And I think there are a lot of ways to be very respectful about that. You know, I think someone mentioned the victory newsletter, and I think that's a great way to kind of frame it, because you've achieved a victory for the client, and you can in that, talk about the impact on clients' lives, while being respectful about that. And I think that continuing to come back to, we are so grateful to you, Mr. or Ms. or whoever volunteer, because you helped us achieve our mission of helping these clients, and continuing to keep that piece of it centered in any recognition, I think is important. You know, you don't want to have a big gala lunch where you're spending a ton of money on your volunteer lawyers, when there's so much work to be done around your clients. So I think it's very easy to maintain that client-centered approach, while still thanking your volunteers, as long as you keep that messaging around your work is so appreciated because this is what it does. I don't know if Kate or Marissa, if you had thoughts on that as well.
Well, I think that volunteers also like talking about the clients they've served. So I know a lot of times if we are going to choose to recognize a volunteer or, use a volunteer quote where they can talk about the volunteering experience, I think that you can definitely also try and focus on eliciting quotes that talk about clients and kind of center the client story in the way the work that is being done is talked about. Because I also don't necessarily think that recognition of volunteers versus centering clients is like a zero-sum game. I think that it can work together, just so long as it doesn't become, oh, look at this fabulous person who does these fabulous things. But, thank you, fabulous person, for doing, thing for XYZ thing for this wonderful person.
Yeah, we actually had a Pro Bono Publico Award winner this year, Ned Pillersdorf from Kentucky, who we make videos of each of our award winners. They're available on the committee's website. And in his video, he says, I thought you got these awards for when you finish the job, and we're not done. My clients still need a lot of help. So even in the process of being recognized for his commitment to pro bono, he himself brought the focus back onto the clients. And I think that, as Kate said, that will happen quite a bit with your volunteers.